Henry Lawson, a 72-year-old retired Marine, thought he and his wife Elaine had finally found peace in their snowbound cabin in the mountains. But one freezing afternoon, a black SUV crunched up their driveway. Two ruthless enforcers, Vince Carrillo and Kurt Meyer, stepped out, men sent by a corrupt syndicate looking to turn the valley into a smuggling route. When Henry refused to sign over the deed, they didn't just threaten him. They dragged him to his own porch and bound him to a wooden pillar. And that was the moment a command roared through the crisp air. His estranged son, Officer Danny Mercer, had just returned home with his combat-trained K9 Shadow. What happened next would turn a scene of execution into a visceral battle for survival, turning the hunters into the prey. And what this family discovered about the buyers would force the old soldier to fight one last war. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The Lawson cabin stood as a sanctuary of warmth amidst the harsh winter. Outside, the snow lay heavy and untouched, silencing the world, while the wind whispered through the treeline, carrying the biting chill of the mountains. It was the kind of afternoon where the isolation felt like a comfort rather than a cage. And tending to the woodpile on the porch stood Henry Lawson, a man whose movements were stiff but disciplined. Henry was 72, his knuckles swollen from the cold, but his posture remained upright, a Marine stance that never quite left him even decades after his service. He wore a thick woolen coat, his breath misting in the air as he stacked logs with methodical precision. Watching from the kitchen window was Elaine, his wife of 40 years, her presence the anchor of his quiet life. The atmosphere was serene but fragile. Henry had just turned to head inside when he heard it, the crunch of heavy tires breaking the crust of the snow. He paused, his eyes narrowing. No one drove up to this elevation in deep winter unless they were lost, or unless they were looking for something specific. A black SUV slowly crawled up the unplowed driveway, the engine growling low. It stopped just yards from the porch steps. Henry's gut tightened. He didn't reach for a weapon, but his muscles locked in preparation. Two men stepped out, dressed not for the cold but for violence. The first, Vince Carrillo, was a towering figure in a dark hoodie, swinging a heavy wooden club against his palm. Beside him was Kurt Meyer, younger, shifting his weight with the nervous energy of a predator. Vince stepped onto the bottom step, looking past Henry at the house. His voice was flat, carrying no warmth. "Afternoon, Mr. Lawson. We're here to finalize that offer on the property. The bosses are getting impatient." Henry stood his ground, blocking the path to the door where Elaine now stood, terrified. "I told you over the phone," Henry said, his voice gravelly but steady. "We aren't selling. This is our home. You can tell your bosses to look elsewhere." Vince smirked, eyes dead and cold. "See, that's the problem, old-timer. We aren't asking anymore. You sign the papers or we burn this place down with you inside." "Get off my land," Henry warned. Vince didn't hesitate. He lunged forward. Henry blocked the first swing, but age had slowed him. Kurt swarmed from the side, overpowering the old Marine. They slammed him against the rough timber of the porch pillar. Elaine screamed from the doorway as Vince produced a coil of rope, binding Henry tight to the beam, leaving him bloodied and exposed. Vince raised the heavy wooden club for a crippling strike. The wind howled, drowning out Elaine's pleas, and then another sound cut through the chaos, the roar of a high-performance engine accelerating hard. The thugs turned toward the driveway just as a tactical truck skidded to a halt, spraying snow. The door flew open before the wheels even stopped. Officer Danny Mercer stepped out, clad in tactical gear, his face set in a mask of righteous fury. But he wasn't alone. Launching from the vehicle like a missile was Shadow, a massive German shepherd, teeth bared and eyes locked on Vince. Danny had come to make amends with his parents, not to find them under siege. But as he saw his father bound and bleeding, the son disappeared, and the officer took over. The silence of the mountain afternoon was not broken by the wind, but by the heavy crunch of tires on packed snow. Henry Lawson stood on his porch, a split log in one hand, watching the black SUV crawl up the unplowed drive. He didn't recognize the vehicle, but he recognized the intent. It moved with a predatory slowness, stopping just yards from the front steps. Inside the cabin, Elaine tapped on the glass, her face pale. Henry motioned for her to stay back. He dropped the log, his breath pluming in the freezing air, and squared his shoulders. At 72, his joints ached with the cold, but the Marine Corps discipline that had kept him alive in Hugh City straightened his spine now. Two men stepped out. The driver, a hulking figure named Vince Carrillo, wore a dark parka unzipped to reveal a heavy flannel shirt. The passenger, Kurt Meyer, was smaller, wiry, with eyes that darted nervously toward the dense tree line. "Mr. Lawson," Vince called out, his voice flat and mocking. He reached into his jacket, not for a weapon but for a folded document. "We're done asking. The syndicate wants the deed signed today. No more emails, no more calls." "I told you," Henry growled, his voice rasping like sandpaper. "This land isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. Now get off my property before I call the sheriff." Vince laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Sheriff's 40 minutes away, old man. You think you have that kind of time?" He signaled Kurt with a tilt of his head. The younger man lunged up the stairs. Henry was ready. He swung a heavy fist, catching Kurt in the jaw. It was a solid hit, staggering the thug, but Henry wasn't 20 anymore. Vince moved with terrifying speed for his size, rushing the porch and slamming his shoulder into Henry's chest. The air left Henry's lungs in a rush. They drove him back against the rough-hewn timber of the porch support beam. Before Henry could recover, Vince produced a length of heavy rope. "Hold him," Vince grunted. Kurt wiped blood from his lip and pinned Henry's arms. They worked with practiced cruelty, binding the old Marine tight to the pillar. The rough bark bit into his back and the rope burned his wrists. Elaine screamed from the doorway, "Henry!" "Shut her up," Vince snapped, raising a heavy wooden club he'd pulled from his belt. He turned back to Henry, raising the weapon high. "Last chance, Lawson. Sign it or I break the legs first." Henry looked up, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, his eyes defiant. "Go to hell." Vince tightened his grip on the club. Muscles coiled. The weapon began its descent. Then the world exploded. A command, sharp as a whip crack, tore through the air from the tree line. "Shadow. Pack in." A streak of black and tan fur launched from the snowbank like a missile. Vince didn't even have time to turn. The German Shepherd hit him mid-swing, 90 pounds of kinetic fury slamming into his chest. Vince's scream was guttural as jaws clamped onto his forearm, the club flying into the snow. Behind the dog, a figure in tactical gear sprinted across the yard. Officer Danny Mercer didn't yell. He moved with silent, lethal efficiency. As Kurt fumbled for a knife, Danny vaulted the porch railing. He struck Kurt with a driving knee to the gut, followed instantly by a palm heel strike to the chin that snapped the thug's head back. Kurt collapsed to the deck, unconscious before he hit the wood. Danny spun, weapon drawn, checking the yard, but the only movement was Vince writhing in the snow, pinned by a growling, snarling shadow. The ambush had been broken in 10 seconds flat. Adrenaline was a familiar drug to Danny Mercer, but seeing his father bound like a criminal on his own porch spiked a different kind of chemical burn in his veins. The snowy yard was quiet again, save for the labored breathing of the two unconscious men and the low, rumbling growl of Shadow, who stood over Vince with possessive intensity. "Shadow, bleeb," Danny commanded softly. The dog's ears twitched, locking into a statue-like vigil over the fallen thug. Danny didn't waste a second on sentimentality yet. He grabbed Vince by the collar of his parka, dragging the heavy man through the snow toward the equipment shed that stood 50 yards from the main house. He returned for Kurt, who was beginning to groan, and hauled him across the ice with less care. Inside the shed, amidst the smell of gasoline and sawdust, Danny zip-tied their wrists and ankles to the heavy workbench legs. They wouldn't be going anywhere. He jogged back to the porch, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden steps. Elaine was already there, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't work the knots binding Henry to the pillar. "Let me, Ma," Danny said, his voice dropping into a gentle register that contrasted with the violence of moments ago. He pulled a serrated tactical knife from his vest and sliced through the ropes. Henry slumped forward, his legs temporarily useless from the strain. Danny caught him, taking the full weight of the old Marine against his chest. For the first time in his life, Danny felt how light his father had become. The realization felt like a punch to the gut. "I'm all right," Henry grunted, trying to push himself upright, though his face was a mask of gray pain. "Just got the wind knocked out of me." "You're bleeding, Dad," Danny said, guiding him through the front door and into the warmth of the cabin. He helped Henry into the sturdy armchair by the fireplace while Elaine rushed to the kitchen to wet a towel. Danny knelt, his eyes scanning his father with the clinical detachment of a first responder. Pupils equal and reactive. Heavy bruising forming on the ribs. Laceration on the temple. It was ugly but not critical. "I had him," Henry muttered, wincing as Danny pressed a gauze pad to his head. "If I was 10 years younger." "I know you did," Danny said quietly. He looked up at his mother as she handed him a glass of water. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with lingering terror. "Ma, talk to me. Who were they?" "That wasn't a random break-in. They knew names." Elaine sat on the ottoman, gripping Henry's hand. "They said they were from a development firm. Crane Holdings, I think. About 3 months ago, men started showing up. At first, they called themselves surveyors. They'd parked down by the creek, watching the house with binoculars." Danny frowned. "Did you call the sheriff?" "We did," Henry interjected, his voice regaining some of its steel. "Sheriff Miller came out twice. Said they were on public access roads and he couldn't do anything unless they trespassed. But the calls? They started calling the landline at 2 in the morning. Dead silence on the other end. Then last week," Elaine whispered, "a drone was hovering over the barn. They weren't just looking at the landlines, Danny. They were watching us. Seeing when we went to town for groceries. Seeing when the lights went out." Danny stood up and walked to the window, peering out at the black SUV sitting ominous and silent in the driveway. The pieces clicked together with a sickening clarity. Surveyors didn't carry lead-weighted clubs. Real estate agents didn't zip-tie 70-year-old men to porch beams in a blizzard. He thought about the tactical precision of their approach, waiting for the heavy snow to limit visibility, cutting off the escape route, the coordinated physical assault to establish immediate dominance. "This wasn't a robbery," Danny said, his voice cold. He turned back to his parents. "And it wasn't a negotiation. This was a hit." Henry looked up, confused. "A hit? Over a few acres of rocky timberland?" "It's not about the timber," Danny said, pacing the small living room. "They came ready to hurt you. They came ready to make you disappear if you didn't sign. That means whatever they want this land for, it's worth killing for. And if they sent 2 guys today and failed." He looked out the window again, watching the snow fall heavier, blurring the tree line where the world ended and the wilderness began. "They'll send more," Danny finished. "We aren't safe here." The transition from the cabin's hearth to the biting cold of the outdoors felt like walking through a physical wall. Danny Mercer zipped his tactical vest higher, the ceramic plates pressing reassuringly against his chest, and stepped off the porch. The snow was falling harder now, thick, wet flakes that swallowed sound and blurred the edges of reality. Behind him, the warm glow of the kitchen window was a reminder of what was at stake. Ahead, the weathered equipment shed stood dark and silent, a tomb for the men who had tried to destroy it. Danny signaled Shadow with a subtle hand motion. The German shepherd, who had been patrolling the perimeter of the porch with restless energy, fell into a perfect heel at Danny's left knee. The dog's demeanor had shifted. Inside the house with Elaine, Shadow had been gentle, nudging her hand with a wet nose. Out here, in the gray light of the storm, he was a weapon system, muscles coiled, ears pricked, amber eyes scanning for threats. Danny slid the heavy bolt of the shed door and stepped inside. The air smelled of stale gasoline, sawdust, and the metallic tang of old iron. He clicked on his tactical light, the harsh white beam cutting through the gloom to illuminate the 2 captives zip-tied to the heavy oak workbench. Vince Carrillo, the larger of the 2, was still slumped over, his breathing ragged and wet, likely a broken rib or 2 from Shadow's initial impact. But Kurt Meyer was awake. The younger man sat shivering against the table leg, his face pale and streaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. When the beam of the flashlight hit him, he flinched, squinting against the glare. Then he saw the dog. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He simply trotted forward, his claws clicking rhythmically on the concrete floor, and sat 3 feet from Kurt's face. A low, subterranean growl began in the dog's chest, a sound that was felt more than heard, vibrating through the small space. Danny didn't speak immediately. He leaned back against a stack of crates, crossing his arms, letting the silence and the cold do the work. In interrogation training, they taught that the fear of pain was often more effective than pain itself. Kurt was already breaking. Danny just needed to tap the glass. "Vince is going to need a hospital," Danny said finally, his voice conversational, almost bored. "Punctured lung, maybe. Hard to say without an x-ray. You, on the other hand, you look healthy enough to talk." "I want a lawyer," Kurt stammered, his teeth chattering. "You can't do this. You're a cop. This is police brutality." Danny laughed softly. It was a cold sound. "I'm not on the clock, Kurt. I'm not in my jurisdiction. And you're not in a precinct. You're in a shed 5 miles from the nearest paved road in a blizzard, with a man whose father you just beat half to death. And Shadow here." Danny gestured to the dog. "He's retired military. He doesn't know Miranda rights. He only knows bite and release. And sometimes, He forgets the second part. At the mention of his name, Shadow let out a sharp, guttural bark, snapping his jaws inches from Kurt's nose. Kurt screamed, scrambling back against the table leg, kicking his heels uselessly against the concrete. Okay. Jesus, call him off. Then tell me the truth, Danny said, his tone dropping, losing all warmth. He stepped into the light, looming over the thug. My father said you're with a developer. Crane Holdings. But developers don't send hit squads to clear a property. Why this land? It's rocky, it's steep, and it's miles from the ski slopes. It's worthless for condos. So why are you willing to kill for it? Kurt swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Danny and the wolf-like beast staring at his throat. It's not for condos, he whispered. Speak up, Danny commanded. Shadow growled, stepping closer. It's the pass. Kurt yelled, the words tumbling out in a panic. The Northern Corridor. The state police set up permanent checkpoints on Highway 93 and the interstate last month. Scanners, dogs, everything. We can't move the shipments through the main arteries anymore. Too much heat. Danny's eyes narrowed. The geography of the valley flashed in his mind. The Lawson property sat at the base of a narrow, old logging trail that cut through the ridge, a trail that bypassed the highway completely and dumped out onto the unregulated service roads on the other side of the mountain range. Smuggling, Danny said, disgust curling his lip. You want to turn my parents' driveway into a drug run. Not just drugs, Kurt muttered, defeated. Everything. Crane. The syndicate, they have contracts. High-value electronics, weapons, product. This land is the cork in the bottle. If they control this property, they control the only invisible route through the Rockies for 200 miles. Your dad? He was just an obstacle in the road. A heavy silence settled over the shed. The stakes had just shifted violently. This wasn't a local land dispute. This was organized crime securing logistics for a multi-million-dollar operation. Henry and Elaine weren't just fighting greedy neighbors. They were sitting on a strategic choke point for a cartel. Danny looked down at the shivering man. You said, the bosses are getting impatient. How impatient? Kurt looked down at his watch, or where it would have been if Danny hadn't removed it. Panic flared in his eyes again, sharper this time. We have a check-in. Every 4 hours. Crane runs a tight ship. If we don't radio in the all clear by sunset. What happens at sunset? Danny pressed, stepping closer. The second wave, Kurt whispered, his voice trembling. They aren't just sending enforcers this time. They have a cleanup crew on standby in town. If we don't signal that the deed is signed and the house is clear, they come to sanitize the site. No witnesses. No loose ends. Just a house fire in the middle of a storm. Danny checked his own watch. The light outside was already fading into the bruised purple of twilight. They had maybe an hour, perhaps less. How many? Danny asked. I don't know, Kurt shook his head. 6? Maybe 8. Heavy hitters. Ex-mercs mostly. They bring night vision, suppression. They don't mess around. Danny stared at the man, feeling the cold settle into his own bones. 6 to 8 heavily armed mercenaries coming to execute his parents and burn their legacy to the ground. He looked at Shadow. The dog looked back, tail wagging once, slowly, sensing the shift in his master's energy. The interrogation was over. The war was about to begin. Danny turned off the flashlight, plunging the shed back into gloom. Hey, don't leave us here. Kurt shouted, struggling against the zip ties. They'll kill us too if they find us tied up. Then you better hope I stop them, Danny said, closing the heavy door and sliding the bolt home. He stepped back into the storm. The wind was howling now, a banshee screamed through the pines. The serene isolation of the cabin had vanished, replaced by the claustrophobic feeling of a kill box. Danny looked at the house, seeing Henry's silhouette moving past the window. He had to turn that home into a fortress, and he had to do it now. The sun was going down and the wolves were coming. Danny Mercer re-entered the cabin, bringing the cold in with him. The blast of freezing air that accompanied the opening of the heavy oak door caused the fire in the hearth to flare wildly, casting long dancing shadows against the log walls. He slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, the metallic thunk sounding final, like the closing of a casket. Henry was still in the armchair, holding a bag of frozen peas to his swollen temple, while Elaine dabbed at the cuts on his wrists with antiseptic. They both looked up as Danny entered, their eyes searching his face for reassurance. They found none. Danny's expression was grim, the mask of the sun replaced entirely by the visage of the officer. We don't have much time, Danny said, his voice low and urgent. He moved to the center of the room, stripping off his wet gloves. Kurt talked. The men in the shed were just the openers. The syndicate has a cleanup crew en route. They're coming to sanitize the site, Dad. They aren't looking to negotiate. Elaine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sanitize. No witnesses, Henry translated, his voice rough. He pushed himself up from the chair, wincing as his bruised ribs protested the movement. They're coming to burn it down. Sit back down, Henry, Elaine pleaded, reaching for his arm. No, Henry barked, though not unkindly. He shrugged off her hand and stood fully upright. He swayed for a moment, steadying himself against the mantel, but when he looked at Danny, the haze of pain in his eyes had cleared, replaced by a cold, hard lucidness. The victim was gone. The sergeant had returned. If they're coming to finish it, we make sure they pay for every inch of ground. Danny, what's your loadout? Standard patrol issue in the truck, Danny replied, shifting instantly into the professional shorthand they shared. Carbine, 3 mags. Pump shotgun. Soft armor. I have a plate carrier and a trauma kit in the lockbox. Not enough for a sustained firefight against mercenaries, Henry assessed, his eyes scanning the room. But it'll have to do. We need to harden the target. This cabin is a fishbowl. Too many windows, too many sight lines. Henry began barking orders, his voice gaining strength with every command. Elaine, I need you to take the heavy wool blankets from the cedar chest. Nail them over the windows in the kitchen and the back bedroom. If they use flashlights or floodlights, I don't want them seeing our silhouettes. If glass breaks, the wool will catch the shards. I'm on it, Elaine said. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She moved with a desperate, frantic purpose, disappearing into the hallway. Danny, Henry continued, pointing a trembling finger toward the heavy oak dining table. That table is 2-inch solid oak. Flip it on its side facing the front door. That's our primary cover. Drag the bookshelves in front of the side windows. We create fatal funnels. Force them to come through the front or the back. I'll get the gear first, Danny said. Shadow watch. He left the dog guarding the interior and sprinted back out to his truck. The wind was ferocious now, a whiteout that stung exposed skin like needles. Danny unlocked the heavy steel drawer system in the bed of his tactical vehicle. He pulled out his plate carrier, heavy with ceramic inserts, and strapped it on over his jacket. Next came the AR-15 carbine, a weapon he checked with practiced ease, seating a magazine and chambering a round. He grabbed the Mossberg 500 shotgun and a bandolier of shells, slinging them over his shoulder. Finally, he grabbed the night vision monocular. Old tech, strictly Generation 2, but better than blind eyes in a blizzard. He hauled the arsenal back inside. The cabin was already transforming. The cozy living room was gone. In its place was a bunker. The massive dining table was overturned, creating a barricade facing the main entrance. The windows were draped in heavy dark wool, suffocating the natural light and making the cabin feel like a cave. Danny set the shotgun on the floor behind the overturned table. Dad, can you shoot? Henry was kneeling by the floorboards near the fireplace, prying up a loose plank with a fire iron. My hands are stiff, Henry grunted, reaching into the hidden cavity. But my eyes are fine. He pulled out a long, canvas-wrapped bundle. He unwrapped it to reveal a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum, but was cared for like a holy relic. An M1 Garand, the wood stock polished to a deep shine, the steel action oiled and immaculate. Haven't fired her in 5 years, Henry murmured, checking the receiver. But she never jams. He looked at Danny. I've got 3 clips of .30-06 armor piercing. It'll punch through a car door at 200 yards. You handle the fast movers, I'll make sure they don't get comfortable behind cover. Check your sectors, Danny said, sliding behind the table to test the sight lines. Elaine, when you're done, I need you in the pantry. It's the only room with no external walls. Keep your head down. Elaine came back into the room, a hammer in her hand. I'm not hiding in the pantry, Daniel. I'm loading shells. You two can't do this alone. Henry looked at his wife, a mix of fear and pride warring in his expression. He nodded once. Stay low. Behind the wood stove. The 3 of them worked in a tense, rhythmic silence for the next 20 minutes. Every loose object was moved. Water buckets were filled in case of fire. The lights were dimmed to low lamps to conserve night vision. The cabin groaned under the assault of the wind, every creak of the timbers sounding like a footstep on the porch. Danny checked his watch. Sunset was 10 minutes ago. They'll be using the darkness to approach. Let them come, Henry said, racking the bolt of the Garand. The metallic clack-clack was loud in the stillness. Suddenly, the hum of the refrigerator died. The low buzz of the electric heater in the corner cut out. The single lamp on the mantel flickered once and died. Total, suffocating darkness swallowed the room, save for the dying embers in the fireplace. "They cut the line," Danny whispered, his voice barely audible in the blackness. "Power's out," Henry confirmed, his voice calm, floating from the shadows near the fireplace. "They're isolating us. No phone, no lights." Danny reached up and clicked a button on his vest. A small red tactical light bathed the immediate area in a bloody glow. He saw Shadow standing by the front door, the hair on his back standing up in a rigid ridge. The dog wasn't growling anymore. He was listening. "Get down," Danny hissed. "They're here." "We're sitting ducks in here," Danny whispered, the red glow of his tactical light painting his face in stark relief. "If they cut the power, they're setting up a perimeter. They want to keep us pinned while they move the heavy pieces into place." Henry, crouched by the barricaded window with his M1 Garand, nodded once. The darkness hadn't frightened the old man, it had focused him. Static defense is a losing strategy against superior numbers. "They'll flank us." "I'm going out," Danny said, checking the seal on his gloves. "I need to disrupt their setup before the main force gets here." Thin the herd. Elaine started to protest from the shadows of the kitchen, but Henry silenced her with a raised hand. "He knows the terrain, Elaine. And he has the dog. It's the only way." Danny moved to the back door, the one facing the dense timberline rather than the driveway. He looked down at Shadow. "Hunt," he murmured. The dog's posture shifted instantly. The tail lowered, the head dropped, and the muscles bunched. Shadow was no longer a pet, he was a guided weapon. Danny slipped the night vision monocular over his left eye. The world turned into a grainy, shimmering green. He cracked the door and the storm seized him. Stepping off the porch was like stepping into a jet engine. The wind screamed through the pines, a deafening roar that erased the sound of his own footsteps. The snow was falling horizontally, a relentless curtain of white that the night vision struggled to penetrate. Visibility was less than 10 yards. To anyone else this weather was a nightmare. To Danny it was cover. He moved low, staying close to the foundation of the cabin before cutting toward the tree line. He didn't rely on his eyes, he watched Shadow. The dog moved like a ghost, weaving through the drifts, nose working overtime to dissect the scent of pine and ozone from the scent of intruders. They moved 50 yards into the woods, circling toward the utility pole where the transformer box sat. Shadow froze. His snout pointed slightly uphill, his body rigid. Danny knelt, blending into a snow-covered shrub. Through the green haze of his optic, he saw a heat signature, a white blob against the darker background of the trees. A man was standing at the base of the pole, looking toward the cabin with thermal binoculars. A spotter. Danny tapped his thigh. Shadow looked back. Danny signaled, "Quiet. Forward." The wind gusted, howling like a banshee. Danny used the noise as a cloak, sprinting across the gap in a low crouch. The spotter never heard him. Danny didn't use his gun. A gunshot would give away the game. He slammed the butt of his knife into the base of the man's skull. The scout crumpled into the snow without a sound. Danny dragged the body into the brush and checked the man's radio. It was crackling with static, but a voice cut through. "Echo 2 report. Do you have eyes on the back door?" Danny left the radio. He moved on. Shadow led him further down the ridge, toward the bend in the driveway where the road curved up from the valley floor. The snow was thigh-deep here, burning Danny's muscles, but the adrenaline kept him warm. He needed to know what was coming. Kurt had said second wave. Danny needed to see the size of the wave. He reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the switchback. The storm was so thick he could barely see the road below, but Shadow was growling low in his throat, a vibration Danny could feel through the leash. Then the darkness broke. Twin beams of light cut through the swirling snow, followed by another pair and then a third. A convoy. Danny pressed himself flat against the rock, peering over the edge. 3 heavy-duty trucks, modified with brush guards and roof racks, were grinding their way up the incline. They weren't moving with the caution of law enforcement. They were moving with the arrogance of an invading force. In the bed of the lead truck, Danny saw the silhouette of a mounted weapon, maybe a heavy machine gun, maybe a floodlight rig. It didn't matter. It was military-grade hardware. 6 to 8 men, Kurt had said. Looking at the vehicles, Danny estimated at least 10, maybe 12. And they were less than 5 minutes from the front porch. Danny's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't a cleanup crew anymore. It was a siege battalion. He had thinned the herd by one, but the pack was at the door. He turned to Shadow. "Home," he whispered urgently. "Go." They turned back into the white void, racing against the approaching headlights, knowing that when those trucks reached the cabin, the quiet war in the woods would turn into a very loud, very bloody last stand. Danny Mercer broke from the tree line just as the world turned white. Not from the snow, but from the blinding, high-intensity floodlights mounted on the lead truck of the convoy. The beams cut through the storm, illuminating the cabin like a stage set for a tragedy. Inside. Now. Danny roared to Shadow, though the dog was already a blur of motion, bounding up the porch steps. Danny hit the deck of the porch, sliding on his chest just as the first volley of automatic fire erupted. The sound was a deafening, continuous tear in the fabric of the night. Bullets chewed into the log walls, sending splinters of wood flying like shrapnel. A round shattered the front window, the glass crunching dully behind the thick wool blankets Elaine had nailed up. He scrambled on hands and knees, dragging himself through the front door and kicking it shut. He threw the bolt home and dove behind the overturned oak table just as the door splintered under a hail of impacts. "They have a saw." Danny yelled over the roar of gunfire, recognizing the distinct cycle rate of a squad automatic weapon. "Keep your heads down. They're suppressing the front to move up on the sides." The cabin was a cacophony of destruction. Pictures fell from the walls. The china cabinet in the corner exploded into dust. But amidst the chaos, a thunderous, rhythmic booming began. BLM. 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 Henry Lawson was returning fire. He wasn't spraying and praying. He was timing his shots between the bursts of incoming fire. The M1 Garand barked with authority, the heavy .30-06 rounds punching through the plywood barricades and out into the night. "Got one." Henry grunted, working the bolt. Saw him drop by the woodpile. Watched the flanks. Danny scrambled to his feet, staying low. "Elaine, the back door. They'll try to breach the kitchen while we're busy here." Elaine didn't answer verbally. She was already moving. She held the Mossberg 500 shotgun with a grip that turned her knuckles white, but her stance was solid. She positioned herself behind the cast-iron wood stove in the kitchen, training the barrel on the rear entrance. The front of the house was being shredded, but the back was ominously quiet. Too quiet. Shadow, who had been pacing the living room with hackles raised, suddenly bolted for the kitchen. He stopped 6 feet from the back door, letting out a sharp, warning bark that ended in a snarl. "They're at the door." Danny shouted, swinging his carbine around. The handle of the back door jiggled violently. Then a heavy boot slammed into the wood near the lock. The frame groaned. Another kick, harder this time, and the wood splintered, daylight showing through the crack. A dark figure in tactical gear prepared to kick it a third time, leveling a submachine gun through the opening. Elaine didn't hesitate. She didn't scream. She exhaled, a sharp, controlled breath, and squeezed the trigger. The boom of the 12 gauge was deafening in the enclosed space. The blast punched through the door at chest height, obliterating the wood and the man standing behind it. The intruder was lifted off his feet and thrown backward into the snow, his weapon clattering uselessly to the deck. Danny stared at his mother. She racked the slide of the shotgun, chick-chack, with a mechanical fluidity that spoke of decades of muscle memory. "I grew up on a ranch, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "I've been shooting coyotes since I was 12. Don't let them in." "Yes, ma'am," Danny breathed. The breach attempt at the back had failed, but the siege was far from over. The enemy knew now that this wasn't just an old couple cowering in the dark. The gunfire at the front intensified, shifting from suppression to targeted destruction. Shadow abandoned the kitchen and sprinted to the side bedroom. He began scratching frantically at the floorboards beneath the boarded-up window, barking a high-pitched alarm. "Shadow's on something," Danny yelled. He sprinted to the bedroom, pressing his ear to the wall. He heard the crunch of snow right outside, and the distinctive clink of metal on wood. "They're climbing," Danny realized. "They're trying to ladder up to the loft window." He looked at the ceiling. The loft had no barricades. If they got up there, they would have the high ground and could rain fire down into the living room. The cabin was no longer a fortress. It was a trap, and the walls were closing in. The gunfire ceased abruptly, leaving a ringing silence that was somehow louder than the chaos. The wind howled through the shattered windows, carrying the acrid bite of gunpowder and the freezing chill of the grave. "Reloading," Henry shouted, fumbling with a fresh clip for the Garand, his fingers stiff and bloody. "Dad, watch the..." Danny started, but the warning died in his throat. The front door didn't open, it exploded inward. A heavy, steel-capped battering ram struck the center of the oak panels with the force of a freight train. The lock shattered, the hinges screamed, and the heavy dining table they had used as a barricade was shunted back 3 feet, scraping gouges into the floorboards. Before the wood settled, a canister clattered across the floor, hissing violently. Thick, gray smoke billowed out, blinding them, choking the air. Gasp! Get low! Danny roared. 3 figures in black tactical gear surged through the smoke, stepping over the ruined doorframe like grim reapers. They moved with a fluidity that was terrifying, weapons raised. Danny raised his carbine, but a spray of suppressive fire from the doorway forced him to dive toward the kitchen island. He was cut off from his parents. Elaine! Henry bellowed. The smoke had swallowed the living room. One of the mercenaries, a giant of a man with a scarred face, emerged from the haze, ignoring Danny and heading straight for the woman reloading the shotgun behind the wood stove. He moved to pistol whip her, knocking the weapon from her hands. Elaine cried out, crumbling to the floor. The mercenary raised his boot to stomp, but he never completed the motion. Henry Lawson, battered, bruised, and 72 years old, surged from the shadows. He didn't have his rifle. He had lost it in the initial blast. In his right hand he gripped his heavy hickory walking cane. He didn't swing it like an old man, he wielded it like a bayonet. With a roar that sounded like it was torn from the throat of a much younger man, Henry drove the brass-tipped end of the cane into the mercenary's solar plexus. The man doubled over, gasping for air. Henry didn't stop. He pivoted on his good leg, the muscle memory of the Marine Corps taking over where his aging body failed. He swung the cane in a vicious arc, the heavy wood connecting with the side of the man's knee. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage. The mercenary screamed and went down. "Get away from my wife!" Henry snarled. He brought the cane down again, striking the man's wrist, forcing him to drop his pistol. Henry stood over Elaine, a guardian lion, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a lethal fire. Meanwhile in the kitchen the war was silent and personal. Danny had been tackled by the leader of the assault team, a professional whose speed matched his own. They had crashed into the counters, Danny's rifle clattering across the tile floor out of reach. The leader, a man with dead eyes and a tactical knife already drawn, lunged. Danny caught the man's wrist, the blade stopping inches from his throat. They struggled, grunting with exertion, boots slipping on the wet floor. The leader was stronger, fresh, and uninjured. Danny was fighting on fumes. "You're dead, cop," the leader hissed, his breath smelling of tobacco and mint. "Just let it go." Danny didn't answer. He slammed his forehead into the man's nose, a brutal Glasgow kiss. Bone crunched and blood sprayed. The leader reeled back, blinded for a microsecond. It was all Danny needed. He didn't go for his weapon, he went for the kill. He swept the man's legs, driving him to the floor. As they fell, Danny twisted the man's wrist, forcing the knife tip down. The impact with the floor drove the blade into the leader's shoulder. The man howled, thrashing, but Danny was on him, applying a chokehold he hadn't used since the academy. He locked it in, squeezing with every ounce of desperate strength he possessed. The leader clawed at Danny's eyes, kicked at his ribs, but Danny didn't let go. He stared at the ceiling, gasping for air, tightening the vise until the man's struggles slowed, then stopped. Danny released the limp body and scrambled up, grabbing his dropped pistol. "Dad. Ma. Clear." Henry's voice came from the living room, rough but triumphant. Danny stumbled through the dissipating smoke. The scene was a tableau of violence. 2 men lay unconscious near the door. Shadow stood over one, teeth bared, daring him to move. The third man, the giant, was groaning on the floor, clutching his shattered knee. And standing over Elaine, leaning heavily on his splintered cane but unbroken, was Henry. He reached down, offering a trembling hand to his wife. "I got you, Elle," Henry whispered. "I got you." Elaine took his hand, pulling herself up. She looked at the carnage, then at her husband, her eyes wide. "I never liked that cane," she managed a shaky laugh. "I take it back." The cabin was wrecked, the door was gone, and the snow was blowing in, but the family was standing. The immediate threat was neutralized. But outside, through the gaping hole where the door used to be, the blue and red strobe of sirens began to bleed into the white darkness. The silence that followed the violence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the whimpering of the mercenary with the shattered knee and the relentless howling of the wind through the destroyed doorframe. But beneath the wind, a new sound began to bleed into the night air, a low, rising wail that grew louder with every heartbeat. Sirens. Danny Mercer slumped against the doorframe, his chest heaving, his tactical vest feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He looked back at his parents. Henry was leaning on his cane, one arm wrapped protectively around Elaine, both of them battered but standing tall amidst the ruins of their home. They were safe. The distress signal Danny had keyed on his radio the moment he arrived had punched through the storm interference. The cavalry was here. But the war wasn't over. From the bottom of the driveway, past the convoy of abandoned trucks, an engine roared to life. It wasn't the heavy rumble of a tactical vehicle. It was the high-pitched whine of a luxury engine pushed to its limit. Danny stumbled out onto the porch, squinting against the snow. Through the swirling white, he saw a sleek black sedan, the command vehicle that had been hanging back in the shadows, fishtailing wildly as it spun around. The driver was cutting his losses, leaving his foot soldiers to rot while he escaped back to the safety of the city. "He's running?" Danny shouted, adrenaline spiking through his exhaustion. He raised his pistol, but the sedan was already moving, weaving erratically down the icy drive. At that distance, a shot was impossible. The risk of a ricochet hitting the incoming patrol cars was too high. The sedan picked up speed, its tires churning up rooster tails of snow. The driver's window rolled down, and a hand extended, firing a desperate, wild shot back toward the cabin. It was an act of pure cowardice and spite. Danny didn't fire back. He looked down at the one weapon he had that was faster than a bullet and smarter than a man. Shadow was already vibrating with kinetic energy, his eyes locked on the fleeing taillights. He looked up at Danny, waiting for the release. "Shadow. Pack in." The command was barely out of Danny's mouth before the German Shepherd launched himself from the porch. He hit the snow running, a black and tan blur cutting through the whiteout. The sedan was accelerating, sliding sideways around the first switchback, but the deep snow and ice were slowing it down. Shadow didn't take the road. He took the direct line. He leaped over a fallen log, scrambled up the embankment, and cut the corner, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Inside the car, the syndicate boss, a man in an expensive coat who had never held a weapon in his life until tonight, glanced in the rearview mirror. He saw the blue lights of the police approaching from the main road below. He cursed, swerving to avoid a ditch. When he looked to his left, he screamed. Running parallel to the car, pacing it at 30 miles an hour, was the dog. Shadow's ears were pinned back, his teeth bared in a snarl that promised violence. The boss panicked. He raised his pistol again, trying to aim through the open window he had used to fire at the house. It was a fatal mistake. Shadow saw the movement. He didn't just run. He coiled his powerful hind legs and launched himself. It was a leap of impossible athleticism, a guided missile of fur and muscle defying gravity. Shadow cleared the gap between the snowbank and the car. He sailed through the open window, his 90-pound frame slamming into the driver's chest. The impact was catastrophic. The gun flew from the boss's hand. Jaws clamped onto the shoulder of the expensive wool coat, sinking deep. The interior of the luxury car turned into a blender of teeth and panic. The boss shrieked, batting uselessly at the animal that was now dominating the small space. With the driver distracted, the sedan veered hard to the right. It plowed through a snowbank, clipped a pine tree with a sickening crunch of metal, and slammed nose first into a ditch. The airbag deployed with a dusty pop, filling the cab with white powder. Danny was already sprinting down the driveway, ignoring the burning in his lungs. He reached the wrecked sedan just as the first sheriff's cruiser skidded to a halt at the bottom of the hill, lights blindingly bright. Danny ripped the driver's door open. The boss was pinned against the steering wheel, coughing, frozen in terror. Shadow was standing on the passenger seat, barking ferociously, his muzzle inches from the man's face, holding him in place with sheer intimidation. "Shadow AWS," Danny commanded, his voice cracking with exertion. The dog instantly silenced, stepping back but keeping his eyes fixed on the target. Danny reached in, grabbed the man by his lapels and hauled him out into the snow. The boss scrambled backward, hands up, trembling violently. "Get him away from me," the man sobbed, looking at the dog. "Keep that thing away from me." Danny looked down at the man who had ordered the execution of his parents. He holstered his pistol and looked at the arriving deputies who were rushing up the hill with weapons drawn. "He's all yours," Danny said, his voice cold. He knelt in the snow and buried his hands in Shadow's thick ruff. "Good boy. Good boy." The boss was cuffed and dragged away, wailing about lawyers and lawsuits. But Danny wasn't listening. He was looking back up the hill, toward the cabin where the lights of the patrol cars illuminated two figures standing on the porch, an old soldier and his wife, waving through the storm. The storm broke just before dawn, the heavy gray clouds fracturing to reveal a sky of piercing, crystalline blue. When the sun finally crested the ridge, it didn't just light the valley, it set the snow ablaze with a blinding, pristine white. It was the kind of morning that made you believe the mountain was innocent, masking the violence of the night before under a fresh coat of powder. But the Lawson cabin told the truth. In the harsh light of day, the damage was staggering. The front door was a gaping maw of splintered oak. The siding was pockmarked with bullet holes, exposing the pale insulation beneath like wounds. The porch railing where Henry had been bound was shattered, and the yard was a chaotic tapestry of tire tracks, trampled snow, and yellow police tape fluttering in the breeze. Inside, the chaos had settled into a dull, administrative hum. Sheriff Miller, a man whose weary face showed every year of his tenure, sat on the edge of the hearth, a notebook on his knee. Two deputies were photographing the wreckage of the kitchen, stepping carefully around the dried blood on the tile. "We have them all," Miller said, closing his notebook. He looked at Henry, who was sitting in the surviving armchair, his ribs taped and a fresh bandage on his forehead. The man Shadow pinned in the car gave up the whole structure. Crane Holdings is done. State police are raiding their offices in Denver as we speak. Turns out, trying to murder a retired Marine and a police officer brings down a hell of a lot of heat. Henry nodded slowly. He held a mug of black coffee with a hand that was swollen and purple, but steady. "They thought we were just old folks in the woods, Miller. They forgot that old folks have survived a lot of winters." "They won't forget again," Miller said. He stood up, adjusting his belt. He looked over at Danny, who was leaning against the wall near the shattered window, scratching Shadow behind the ears. The dog was asleep on his feet, exhausted but refusing to lie down while strangers were in the house. "That's a hell of a dog you got there, Mercer," Miller said. "And some hell of a shooting." Danny looked at the sheriff. He looked at the devastation of his childhood home and then at his parents. Elaine was sweeping up glass in the dining room, moving with a stiff determination, refusing to let the chaos win. Henry was battered, looking every day of his 72 years, but his eyes were clear. They had survived, but it had been too close. Too damn close. Danny pushed off the wall. "Sheriff," he said, keeping his voice low, "you still looking to start that K-9 program you talked about last year?" Miller paused, raising an eyebrow. "Budget was approved, but I couldn't find a handler worth a damn." "Why?" "I'm putting in my transfer papers on Monday," Danny said. He didn't look back at the city. He looked at his father. "I'm done with the city. Shadow needs more room to run. And I think I need to be closer to home." Miller smiled, a slow, genuine expression that cracked his weathered face. "I'll have the paperwork on my desk by noon. Welcome home, Danny." As the police cruisers finally crunched their way down the driveway, leaving the valley in silence once more, the family moved out onto the porch. The air was biting cold, but the sun was warm on their faces. They sat on the top steps, Henry, Elaine, and Danny. Shadow flopped down heavily across Danny's feet, letting out a long, contented groan as he finally closed his eyes. Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out his pipe. He didn't light it. He just held it, tracing the wood grain with his thumb. "We're going to need a new door," Elaine said softly, staring at the empty frame. "I'll build one," Henry said. "Solid oak this time. Reinforced steel frame." "I'll help," Danny added. Henry looked at his son. For years there had been a silence between them, the gap between the father who stayed and the son who left. But as they sat there, breathing the same cold air, watching the steam rise from their coffee, that gap was filled. "You fought good, Danny," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion he would never fully articulate. "You fought real good." "I had a good teacher," Danny replied. They sat in silence as the sun rose higher, reclaiming the mountain from the shadows. The cabin was battered, the windows were broken, and the scars of the night would last for years. But the foundation was deep, the walls were standing, and the pack was together. They were bruised, they were bloody, but they were unbroken.
If this officer and his canine partner touched your heart, don't let them fade into just another story you watched. A like costs you nothing. It takes just 2 seconds to subscribe and like this video. But so many of you will close this and forget. Don't be that person. Subscribe, like, and drop a comment sharing what the story meant to you. These stories need voices like yours.